Yesterday was an important day in the battles on the Ukrainian battlefronts, and we'll come to that shortly. But before we do, let's first of all turn to the news that President Erdogan has done an entirely typical 180-degree turn. From having appeared to oppose Swedish membership of NATO, he has now agreed to it. And as I've said many times, this is in fact entirely in character. People who assume that his opposition to NATO membership for Sweden, just as they assumed that his opposition to NATO membership for Finland was for real, were certainly mistaking themselves. And he came along and he travelled to Vilnius, and the fact that he was ready for a deal was signalled by a quip that he made on the way. He said, why don't we swap NATO membership for Sweden with EU membership for Turkey? Now, he'd been floating the idea of Turkish membership of the EU. He knows perfectly well, of course, that there's no European state at the moment that would agree to Turkey joining the EU, and some of them are adamantly opposed. The moment he combined that, he matched that with, he put that proposal, which he, by the way, first floated the idea of reopening the question of Turkey's membership of the EU in a conversation he had with President Biden. But the moment he linked the issue of Turkish membership of the EU with Swedish membership of NATO, he was obviously and clearly signalling that he's in for a deal, that this is, as far as he's concerned, a bargain that needs to be made. And sure enough, some sort of a bargain was made. We don't know what that bargain is, but the likelihood is the most probable deal that has been made is for the supply of F-16 fighters by the United States to Turkey. Now, Turkey was a party to the F-35 program. The United States basically stopped sales of F-35 fighters to Turkey when Turkey bought the S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from Russia. The United States put enormous pressure on Turkey to cancel that deal, but Erdogan refused. The S-400s were in the process, in the event, they were actually supplied to Turkey. They are part of Turkey's military arsenal. Erdogan has at times floated the idea of buying more, but of course he's also made a big play about the fact that the F-35s were never delivered, despite the fact that Turkey invested and participated in the F-35 program. And then some time ago, about a year and a half ago, a sort of agreement was reached, or at least a proposal was floated, that F-16 fighter jets, the United States would supply Turkey with more and more advanced F-16 fighter jets, and in substitution for the F-35. Now, of course, the F-16 comes in many different variants. These would be the latest variants with the most advanced electronic scanning radars, and it was an attractive proposition for Turkey. It would not get the F-35, but it would get an aircraft with greater capabilities than the aircraft that Turkey currently has, which are F-16s of an older generation. And at the same time, it would keep the Turkish F-16 fleet streamlined. It would mean that Turkish pilots would transition from the oldest F-16s to the more modern F-16s. Except that this delivery of F-16 fighters ran into all sorts of problems. People in Congress were not happy. There was opposition, some opposition from the White House. What seems to have happened is that in return for Erdogan agreeing to Swedish membership for Swedish membership in NATO. He agreed NATO membership for Sweden. Sorry, he agreed. The United States, Biden, basically said that they would make sure that Turkey did get its F16s. So that's probably the deal. Now, I have to say, it is part of a sequence of decisions that Erdogan has made over the last few weeks, which will to some extent at least irritate the Russians. The Russians are not, in my opinion, particularly concerned about Swedish membership of NATO. They've long since been aware that Sweden and the United States have very, very close military relations indeed. Of course, there's not been any US troops in Sweden or indeed in Finland, but everybody knows that in a crisis they could be moved there very quickly, whether these countries are members of NATO or not. And in fact, Sweden specifically has been under the NATO nuclear umbrella, under a deal done in the 1960s by the then Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander with the United States. And that, of course, was a long time ago. But it indicates the extent of the long-standing military relationship between Sweden and the United States and between Sweden and NATO. And of course, Sweden regularly supplies weapon systems to various NATO countries, and it cooperates with various NATO countries in weapons development. So in formal terms, this changes Sweden's status from a neutral state to a NATO state, but in practical terms, it makes less difference. And I've been told by various people that in fact, from a Russian point of view, it actually simplifies Russian military planning. From a Russian point of view, the Scandinavian region would likely be an important theatre in any future war, and Russia has an inherent superiority in conventional power in this particular region. So from their point of view, having Finland and Sweden as neutral countries might have actually been an obstacle if they purported to recognise Finnish and Swedish neutrality in terms of an armed conflict, a neutrality which would not have been fully real. Now they can simply plan and prepare for the fact that these are hostile countries, members of NATO, and in terms of Sweden, it has always been so. As I never cease to say, for the Russians, Finnish membership of NATO was a more serious matter. The Soviet Union used to have a very close relationship with Finland. The Soviet Union and Finland agreed at the end of the Second World War that Finland would be neutral, and in return the Soviets basically held back from acting in Finland as they did in the rest of Eastern Europe. The Russians feel much more bitter and much more angry by what they see as Finland's turning its back on its relationship and on the promises it gave at the end of the Second World War than they do about Sweden, which they have never seen as a truly neutral country. But anyway, coming back to Erdogan, it is the last in a long list over the last couple of days of actions that he has taken which has annoyed the Russians. He's received President Zelensky in Ankara in Turkey. He's given President Zelensky the Azov commanders who it had been promised would remain in Turkey until the conflict had ended. It has meant that he has also reached agreements with President Zelensky about military cooperation, about building a factory to make Bayraktar drones in Ukraine, a factory which the Russians are certain to destroy. And as has been pointed out by many people, the Bayraktar drone, anyway, is one that the Russians have shown no difficulty suppressing on the battlefields. It hasn't actually worked particularly well, at least not for Ukraine. And as has also been pointed out, the family, that the person who owns Bayraktar is a member of Erdogan's extended family. So in a sense, this is also, for Erdogan, a financially lucrative deal in terms of his own family as well. I believe the owner of the Bayraktar company is actually Erdogan's son-in-law. So there are, shall we say, some material considerations perhaps in play as well. And all of this has now been capped by this decision, and by this decision to admit Sweden into NATO, perhaps in return for getting the F16s. And as I said, this caps a list of actions and statements, including, by the way, support for Ukraine's NATO membership, which will not have pleased the Russians. But the Russians will take this eventually in their stride, because the relationship with Turkey is too important to them. They are used to this kind of double dealing from Erdogan by now. It's nothing unexpected to them. And though they don't like it, they've made a decision, they made that decision long ago, that they will just have to accept it. I would say that Erdogan might find that he has miscalculated in one sense. By agreeing to Sweden's membership of NATO, he has now lost whatever leverage holding that up perhaps gave him. And he may think that he has a deal with the United States for the supply of F-16 fighter jets, but it's far from certain that the Biden White House will deliver. Perhaps it won't be able to deliver because opposition in Congress might be too strong, or it might be divided over this issue itself. And in any event, it would not be the first time when this particular White House has given assurances in return for actions by the other side, which it has not been prepared to act upon. But that's a problem that Erdogan might have to face in the future. If things do turn out like that, he will no doubt be annoyed with the Americans, as apparently he is currently annoyed with the Russians over the Russian refusal to renew the grain deal and the advance of the Syrian army in Syria. But as I said, that's from a Russian point of view, and perhaps even an American point of view, going to be Erdogan's problem. And we'll see what comes. Now, this is all I'm going to say about this topic. I don't think it is actually of enormous importance. What is of much more importance is what is going on in the war. And yesterday, as I said, was an important day on the Ukrainian battlefronts. Now, I've discussed at length, as have multiple others, about the seeming change in Ukrainian tactics on the battlefronts. The fact that they have stopped trying to make armoured attacks on Russian positions, that they instead send small groups of light infantry, accepting enormously heavy losses as these light infantry march into the Russian guns and machine guns. But anyway, they've tried to hold most of their armour and most of their heavy machines back. Yesterday was different. In a place near a village called Rabotino on the front lines, in the Orechov area, or so I understand, Ukraine's tried another armoured attack. And I strongly suspect that this was a last-ditch attempt to try to achieve some kind of breakthrough on the eve of the NATO summit meeting in Vilnius, because this broke the usual pattern. It was as every other single armoured attack that Ukraine has launched up to this point, a complete failure. And pictures are already circulating showing 5 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles burnt out and destroyed on the steppes. And there's reports, at least Vladimir Rogov, the political figure from the Zaporozhye regional government established by Russia, he claims, or he says that he believes, that 3 Leopard 2 tanks have been destroyed as well, which would bring, by the way, the total of Leopard 2 tanks destroyed, if this claim is correct, to 19, which would be roughly a third of the total supplied up to now. So that's what Vladimir Rogov has said. One can't, of course, confirm that, but there's every indication that the attack towards Rabutino yesterday was a failure and that large numbers of equipment, machines, were destroyed, including another 5 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. And there's been some further claims, by the way, that the claims that Ukraine was holding back large numbers of troops in reserve, that the brigades have not been, that all of the brigades that the West has trained for the offensive have not so far been committed. There's some suggestions that this is actually wrong, and that in fact 4 of the 6 remaining brigades have now been deployed to the battlefronts because other brigades, replacing other brigades which participated in the original attacks, but which have had to be pulled back. There was also another Ukrainian attack in the Piatikhatki area. Now, this is a place from which Ukraine withdrew some troops, and there was some speculation, including speculation which I indulged myself in on this channel, about why this had been done. But anyway, the Ukrainians yesterday returned to the Piatikhatki area. They launched another attack. As has now become the pattern, they were able, this is a more light attack, there were fewer armoured vehicles. They advanced, they occupied a Russian trench. The Russians had booby-trapped the trench. The moment the Ukrainian infantry were inside the trench, the Russians ignited the various explosive devices they'd installed in the trench. Lots of Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Then the Russian artillery opened fire, and the Ukrainians were driven back. The trench, then, that way, can be reoccupied by the Russians. And interestingly enough, by the way, yesterday, there was an article in the London Times describing the fighting in Ukraine, the progress of Ukraine's offensive. This article went out of its way to try to give an optimistic spin to the progress of Ukraine's offensive, but it grudgingly conceded that a lot of progress so far has not been made. And the headline, the rather bleak headline, spoke simply about the Ukrainians occupying Russian trenches, only for the Russians to drive them back and to reoccupy them. And that seems to be the general story up to this point. Now, we still have some way to go. No doubt Ukraine will soon be receiving these cluster munitions. We'll see what the difference they'll make. I'll talk about that in a moment. France has said that they will supply long-range missiles. These are probably similar sorts of missiles to the Storm Shadows which the British have already supplied. Storm Shadow is actually an Anglo-French project. I understand the French missiles are slightly different from the British ones, but anyway, the French are going to supply those, also in support of the offensive. But the very fact that the West is having to dip in and supply more weapons tells you already that things are not going well, and the fact that the West was insisting before the offensive began that Ukraine had been supplied with all the weapons that it needs. Well, clearly that was wrong. Now, on that topic, I've revisited an interview that General Zaluzhny and General Syrski gave to The Economist last September, which is actually, in some ways, a rather downbeat interview. But General Zaluzhny, in that interview with The Economist, set out what he felt he needed for a successful offensive to break the Russian land bridge and to isolate and eventually capture Crimea. And he said that he needed 300 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 155mm howitzers. Now, he didn't get all that he demanded, but actually, looking at things, he got a surprisingly large amount of what he wanted. He got probably around 300 tanks. In fact, probably more than that once the Leopard 1s and the Abrams tanks appear on the scene. But he got a lot of tanks, most of them ex-Soviet or East European adaptations of ex-Soviet T-72s. But he got around 250 tanks from the West for this offensive, not far short of the 300 he said he needed. He said he needed 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles. Well, he got 200 infantry fighting vehicles from the Americans, Bradleys and Strykers. He's received more, by the way. He also got large numbers of infantry fighting vehicles, again ex-Soviet types, from the East European members of NATO. Perhaps he didn't get 600 to 700, but he got a substantial proportion of those. He didn't get the number of guns that he was asking for, because, to be straightforward about it, I don't think that number of guns exists in the West anymore. I think that if the West was to give Zaluzhny 500 155mm howitzers, well, they would be desperately short of guns, and besides, as we've seen, they don't have the ammunition for them. But Zaluzhny at that point, this is in September, wasn't complaining about lack of air power. He wasn't complaining about lack of long-range missiles. You can see how his demands have evolved, how he's now demanding things that he wasn't asking for before, as the military realities start to set in. Anyway, there we go. He got most of what he wanted. It's understandable, perhaps, why some people in the United States are irritated about the fact that he repeatedly comes back and asks for more, but the fact remains he hasn't achieved the breakthrough that he seemed to promise back in September on the basis of the equipment deliveries he was asking for then. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to say. Now, there's been a lot more about the question of the cluster munitions, comments by Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor, and in fact there was a very interesting discussion of the question of cluster munitions from Douglas McGregor in an interview he had, which you can find on YouTube, with Judge Napolitano. And Douglas McGregor said that he certainly didn't think that these cluster munitions were going to change anything significant in the war. He spoke of them as being an out-of-date weapon. And he suggested that their rationale was, again, to break up, to disperse large numbers of light infantry and perhaps armoured vehicles attacking. You wanted to shell these. You didn't have the precision weapons that you do today to pick off one tank or armoured vehicle at a time. And the result was that you came up with this type of equipment, these cluster munitions. And I think the most interesting point that he made is that he saw them very much as a legacy of the Vietnam War era. The United States during the Vietnam War was confronted by a Vietnamese enemy which did possess a certain number of tanks and armoured vehicles and guns, but which was to a great extent a light infantry force. And they were extremely effective operating in jungles, and cluster munitions in part were intended to counter troops like that fighting in wooded and jungle territory. And he said that this really isn't particularly relevant to the Ukrainian battlefields today. He may be right. Seems to me to make perfect sense. He is a professional military officer, and I presume he knows what he's saying. And he also seemed to suggest that cluster munitions might not actually be quite as effective against heavy armour tanks as some people have suggested. He suggested that he himself thought that they were of only relatively limited use. If you fired cluster munitions and then tried to advance through a field, well, the munitions would be there lying across the fields. Some of them would not have exploded. They might actually interfere with your own advance, and this was some of the things that he discovered in Iraq in 1991. Now, I think it's fair to say that Scott Ritter takes a slightly less sanguine view of, in military terms, of cluster munitions. He appears to feel, he's worked in the Marine Corps artillery, he feels that they are an effective weapon if used in a specific role, but he too also doesn't seem to think that they will be particularly effective in countering Russian defences for this offensive that we're seeing today. Now, I'm going to just add to this one thing, something that I saw which appeared in the British media, and it spoke of a revulsion against the use of cluster munitions that began following the fighting in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. And it said that over the course of that fighting, which I remember very well, Israel used around 2 million of these shells, which seems an astonishingly large number. A lot of civilians were killed, and this caused a revulsion, a wave of revulsion, and it was what led to the criticism of cluster munitions. Now, I'm a trifle sceptical about this claim that as many as 2 million of these shells were fired over the course of that fighting. But what I would say is, if that is true, and if Israel did use cluster shells, cluster munitions, on a large scale in that particular battle, well, that was a case of Israel attacking fortified positions created in southern Lebanon by the Hezbollah militia. And the key thing is that Israel failed to break through. So it would seem that, judging at least from that example, and this is only something I read in the British media, if people know otherwise and are able to correct this, I welcome them doing so. But anyway, if this is correct, then that appears to bear out points made by Scott Ritter and Douglas MacGregor, that these weapons are not, in fact, particularly effective used against fortified positions such as the ones that Ukraine is confronting in southern Ukraine or Western Russia, which you prefer at the present time. So I just wanted to say that. Now, there has been a lot of criticism around the world of the US decision to supply cluster munitions to Ukraine. And various NATO governments have come out and have spoken out against it. And it includes many of the US's key allies. So Germany, Italy, Spain, Britain have all said that they disapprove of the supply of cluster munitions to Ukraine. The Guardian, which in newspaper, which cannot be accused of being anything less than totally supportive of Ukraine to an extreme degree, has actually come out and published an editorial which also criticises this decision. It says that even if these systems are indeed effective, that doesn't justify their use. It makes the point, which several others have also made, that chemical weapons can also be effective in certain military situations, and yet they are universally prohibited. So the argument of effectiveness does not in itself justify their use. So we've had criticisms from NATO allies. We've also had criticism from around the world. Switzerland, perhaps not a NATO state, but nonetheless pro-Western overall, has also criticised their use. So interestingly has Cambodia. The Prime Minister of Cambodia has said that to this day, Cambodia has to deal with unexploded cluster bomblets left over from the Indochina wars of the late 1960s, early 1970s. To this day, people died from these things, and he said it would be a tragedy and a disaster if they were used in Ukraine. I, for my part, am a little surprised, and I say this honestly and with humility, that this particular issue, the issue of these particular shells, has cut through in the way that it has. After all, the West has been supplying Ukraine with all kinds of deadly weapons for a year and a half now. These weapons have prolonged the war, caused enormous suffering and death, and of course the Western powers, as I've discussed many times, have shown no real interest up to this point in a negotiated solution to the conflict, and they sabotaged a negotiated solution that was not only on the table but had actually been initialed and agreed in principle between Russia and Ukraine in March and April of last year. And of course the United States and Britain have also supplied Ukraine with depleted uranium shells. So I'm not quite sure why cluster munitions have cut through in this way. It is true that a lot more countries have banned their use and that there is a convention which purports to outlaw them. But up to this point, the Western public, at least the media public, have been very, in my opinion, alarmingly relaxed about weapons deliveries to Ukraine. And as I said, quite why it's taken the supply of cluster munitions to make people sit up and notice, I'm not really entirely sure. But then, that sometimes is what happens in war. I was myself, for example, surprised that there was so little opposition to the bombing of Serbia in 1999 and so much more opposition to the attack on Iraq in 2003, and I wasn't entirely able to understand why one was so much more of a cause célèbre in the West than the other. But anyway, leaving that aside, I do nonetheless want to reiterate a particular point. This has cut through. The Western public has noticed this. That might, in time, start a kind of snowball effect in which people begin to become more and more critical of the supply of weapons to Ukraine. But for the moment, all of this criticism is of a token nature. It will not change policy in the United States. It will not change overall reporting in the West of the war. It will not dissuade those who support continuation of the war from continuing to do so. And I'm afraid that's where we are. That's the reality. Those of us who are generally appalled, not just by this decision to supply these particular weapons, but by the way in which this war has been first provoked and then prolonged. It's a fact that we must face. Anyway, returning to the situation on the battlefronts, the attack on Rabotino and the attack on in the Piatichatki area that Ukraine launched yesterday must be seen, in my opinion, as I've said, as a last-ditch attempt by Ukraine to achieve some kind of breakthrough, some kind of real advance on the eve of NATO's Vilnius summit. And as we've seen, it's failed. There were advances yesterday, but they did not take place. They were not achieved by Ukraine. And there's more information that the Russians, for example, are now starting to push Ukrainian forces back in the Bakhmut area. I will continue to refer to the area, by the way, as the Bakhmut area to avoid confusion, even though, of course, the Russians can call the town of Bakhmut, the former Bakhmut, which they now control, they call it Artyomivsk. When I refer to the town, I will generally call it Artyomivsk, but the area I will continue to call the Bakhmut area. All of this fact that, as I said, the Russians seem to be pushing the Ukrainians back in this area, at least in places, despite an extraordinary tweet by General Syrskyi yesterday, the ground forces commander, Ukraine's ground forces commander, whose entire role, so far as I can see, seems to be to try to achieve some kind of breakthrough in the Bakhmut area. He was the person who organised Bakhmut's defence, and he now seems to be the person who's organising the various attempts to recapture Bakhmut. It seems that he's stuck in Bakhmut, and it seems to me that he shares the same obsession with the place that President Zelensky had. Anyway, he released an extraordinary tweet yesterday in which he said that Bakhmut is under the fire control of the Ukrainian army. Now, I don't understand that unless Russian reports about the state of the fighting there are completely wrong. I can't understand how that can possibly make any sort of sense. And besides, there's no evidence up to this point that any of these places near and around Bakhmut, which the Ukrainians would presumably need to capture before they launch an assault on Artyomivsk, Bakhmut itself, places like Kleshchevka, Kurdyumovka, any of those places have, as of the time of making of this video, been recaptured by Ukraine. Now, it may be, as I said, that the situation there is more complicated than I know, but the Russian forces, now reinforced by Chechen fighters, the latest report suggested that they're back on the attack, and there's in fact even been a comment by Kadyrov which essentially says as much. But there's been important news from two other places. Now, the first piece of news is very tentative and might not be true, but there's been very intense fighting over the last few weeks in the Avdiivka area. The Ukrainians, well, before the offensive began, the Russians started a major advance which appeared to be aimed at encircling Avdiivka way back in March. They made steady progress. Some time ago they captured the village of Krasnogorovka, as I've discussed before. They managed to capture other places. It's been, as is always the way with the Russians, a gradual, incremental advance, but all the indications were that they were making significant progress and they were gradually tightening a vice round Avdiivka. And then, in conjunction with their counteroffensive on the southern battlefields, the Ukrainians launched lots of counterattacks in the Avdiivka area, and it's not been at all easy to make much sense of what's going on. There's been claims that the Ukrainians recaptured some ground, other claims that they were repelled. I'm not have anything remotely like a granular sense of the fighting there. But yesterday, the Russians claimed that they not only repelled all the Ukrainian attacks, but that they'd established fire control of the main road, the one remaining road, leading into Avdiivka, which the Ukrainians used to resupply the garrison there. Fire control means that the Russians don't actually occupy the road. Their troops are stationed on it, but that they're in a position to shell any Ukrainian vehicles that move along this road, and shell not from a distance, but from reasonably close range, so that they can probably have these vehicles in their line of sight. Now, that is true, and if the Russians are able to consolidate this gain and perhaps build upon it, then the Ukrainians will be left with a difficult choice. Do they defend Avdiivka or do they pull out? If they defend Avdiivka, they risk having their troops there getting cut off, and at that point things might start to become extremely difficult and a cauldron in which these Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka find themselves. It might start to emerge. More likely, I guess, there'll be more Ukrainian counterattacks to try to reverse this Russian advance. But I get the sense that despite fierce Ukrainian counterattacks in the Avdiivka area, it is the Russians overall who have the initiative and the momentum. And the same, by the way, is true further south in Marinka. The Ukrainians still there cling to some very heavy fortified positions on the western fringes of Marinka, but the Russians do seem to be ever so slowly capturing more and more of these positions and clearing what's perhaps left of Marinka of Ukrainian troops. But in some ways, as I said, Avdiivka is the more interesting battle, because there is a real possibility, though not a proximate one, of Ukrainian troops being cut off, with difficult decisions, as I said, for the Ukrainians to make if that happens. Certainly the loss of Avdiivka would be a major blow for Ukraine. It would push Ukrainian artillery further away from Donetsk city. Avdiivka has been a major place that Ukraine has used to launch artillery strikes on Donetsk city. Avdiivka itself was a significantly sized place before the war. It had a population of around 35,000. It was in some ways the biggest suburb of Donetsk city that remained under Ukrainian control. And its loss, the loss of this important place so close to Donetsk city, would, I think, be a significant psychological blow for Ukraine. And perhaps even more importantly, it would be a major psychological lift for the inhabitants of Donetsk city, who would finally see a moment when this long Ukrainian siege of Donetsk city had been finally lifted. When the day they would start, no doubt, to feel that the day when they no longer had to fear Ukrainian shelling might finally be starting to appear over the horizon. Anyway, that was important news, if it is true, but I want to stress again, the reports are very vague. They don't come from particularly, perhaps, the most reliable sources. I've gained them from various Telegram channels. One can't be absolutely sure that this is indeed what's happening, but it is consistent with the pattern of the fighting in the Avdiivka area for a while. And by contrast, it does seem that Russian advances in the Kupyansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman area are now gaining further momentum. We've had a comment like this, for example, from our old friend, retired Lieutenant Colonel Andrei Marochko of the Lugansk militia, and he says that he's obviously being used as a kind of unofficial spokesman by the Lugansk authorities. Anyway, he says the Russian armed forces significantly advanced towards the city of Kupyansk. Several areas in the eastern part of Kharkiv region were liberated, and according to Marochko, Ukrainian occupation authorities, that's what he calls the Ukrainians, have evacuated government agencies whilst business people are relocating their businesses to western Ukraine. Now, again, that's from Marochko, but there is actually here a much more impressive accumulation of information. Again, it doesn't have the granular detail that we've seen about fights in places like Rabotino or Piatikhatki and all the rest, but there is an accumulation of evidence that there are very significant Russian advances taking place in these northern front lines, that the Russians are now coming close to other places along the Oskol River, that Kupyansk itself is coming ever closer to the point of being invested, and to the point where the Russians might launch a serious attempt to recapture it, and that the Russians are also gradually pushing closer to Liman, and that there's been reports that they've captured some important settlements along the way. So this is clearly the place to watch. There was also a report yesterday, which I read on Slavyangrad, generally, as I've said many times before, a reliable source of information, even if it is a pro-Russian one. That doesn't, of course, the one doesn't, of course, exclude the other. But I read on Slavyangrad that the Russians seem to be now moving some of their reserve troops, these 180,000 reserve troops that they've been training up in Russia, closer to the conflict area. And there was a comment by one of the actually rather insightful commentators on Slavyangrad that these reserve troops are not necessarily themselves going to be involved in conducting offensives, but they will release more professionally trained troops, contract troops, long-standing troops, more experienced troops, to carry out offensives instead, and that these reserve troops will be able to take the place of those troops who are going to be released to conduct offensives, that they're going to be able to take their place on the battle lines and hold the positions that those troops are assigned to an offensive will now be conducting. Now, this is an interesting development, and by the way, it correlates closely with what the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu said to Putin about 2 weeks ago during a Security Council meeting, when they discussed, the Russian Security Council discussed the overall progress or lack of it of Ukraine's offensive, and Shoigu gave an update about the general situation to Putin. And Shoigu spoke about large Russian military formations that had been formed with called up reservists and volunteers and people who were signing contracts with the Russian military. And he spoke about 2 tank armies and an army corps that were being formed. And he said that training of these units would be completed by the end of June. Well, we're now on the 11th of July, assuming that the training of these units, these large military formations, is now completed. It would make logical sense that some of them are now starting to be moved closer to the battle lines. And perhaps it's these formations, these 2 tank divisions and this army corps, that are involved. Now, I'm aware that some commentators, Simplicius the Thinker and others like him, have suggested that these 2 divisions, these 2 army groups, these 2 armies, these 2 tank armies, and this army corps were intended to balance, to counter Finland's and Sweden's entry into NATO. I read Shoigu's actual comments about the Security Council meeting. That was not my impression. My impression was that they were intended to be used in the special military operation. And after all, Shoigu reported to Putin about the training and organization and preparation of these three large military formations in the context of a Security Council meeting, which was specifically about the special military operation. So I, for one, am sceptical about the theory that they're intended to counter Swedish and Finnish troops who've now joined NATO. I think that the Russians will be developing and deploying troops in that area in the future. But I think these particular units that have been trained up and whose training was to be completed by the end of June, I get the sense that they were always intended for use in the special military operation. And at some point, we will see that happen. Anyway, there we are. We will see how the situation on the battlefields evolves. Meanwhile, NATO is now holding its meetings. President Biden has arrived in Lithuania, in Vilnius. Before long, the meetings will start properly. The entire summit meeting is due to last for no more than, for 2 days. It's highly likely that we're going to get very belligerent statement or very strong statement about China and NATO committing itself to some kind of role in the Indo-Pacific region, something which will infuriate and antagonize the Chinese. We'll come to that shortly. But of course, the prime focus at the moment is Ukraine. And we had a whole series of statements yesterday about Ukraine. There's been suggestions that Ukraine will not will not need a membership action program before it joins NATO. Now, some people see this as a concession to Ukraine. Actually, it seems to me that it's almost more likely that it is a way of kicking the question of Ukraine's membership into the long grass, saying, well, you know, we're not going to give you a membership action plan at this summit. You're never actually going to have a membership action plan because you don't really need a membership action plan. The trouble is, without a membership action plan, it's not really quite clear how exactly Ukraine organises itself to become a member of NATO. It's not like Finland and Sweden, which, by the way, also entered NATO, skipping a membership action plan procedure. It's not like that. It's rather more a case of a country, Ukraine, which is going through a tremendous conflict, which has massive problems, whose military is in a huge state of flux, which is disorganized in many respects, having to join NATO. And it seems to me saying that Ukraine isn't going to get a membership action plan looks like a way of saying, well, we're not going to actually give you any kind of plan to join NATO at any time, at least not in the future. And we've had further comments, including ones from President Biden, that the topic of Ukraine joining NATO isn't really open for discussion until the conflict ends. I have repeatedly said how disastrous that formulation is, how all it does is incentivize the Russians to keep the war going indefinitely, which they are fully able to do, or at least until they finally win. And at the same time, we are hearing a great deal more about security guarantees, except, of course, that these security guarantees, at least the ones that have been talked about, don't really seem to change the situation at all from what we are seeing at the moment, because they don't apparently call for any NATO country to go into Ukraine to fight the Russians. If Ukraine finds itself in extremis, if the Russians attack or whatever, it just says that they should continue to supply Ukraine with equipment and weapons and machines and all of those things, which is, of course, no different from what they're doing at the moment. And it's been suggested that giving these guarantees effectively locks countries into an indefinite commitment to Ukraine. But of course, a guarantee that is given is a guarantee that can be withdrawn, or a guarantee that is not going to be acted on. It doesn't appear to be a treaty obligation that is being discussed, because, of course, a treaty obligation would be a little too close to creating a kind of alliance relationship, which clearly these security guarantees, it's not about that at all. Now, Scott Ritter, in a recent programme, made the absolutely valid point that the entire logic of this offensive that Ukraine has launched is to provide, it was to provide NATO with evidence of substantial territorial gains by Ukraine that would catapult Ukraine into NATO and which would secure for Ukraine unlimited pledges of NATO support. In that respect, to the extent that that is true, and I think Scott Ritter is absolutely right, the offensive has already failed. It has failed to achieve breakthroughs in any part of the front line. It's failed to recapture any significant territory. Attempts to attack the Kerch Bridge a particularly reckless attempt to launch a missile at a nuclear power plant in Russia, which also took place a short time ago with a missile the Russians shot down. At least that's the Russian claim. Anyway, even that, all of those attempts to achieve these big attacks, none of that has big gains, or at least something big that might be the talk of the hour at the Vilnius summit meeting. None of that has happened. So the result is a meeting is going to take place at Vilnius, which was building up to something big, but now finds itself in a position of, well, let's say anticlimax. And one does get the sense of Western leaders deeply confused about what to do. We discussed how the more realistic people in Washington urgently want talks with the Russians. We see, however, how the hardliners in Washington and in London deeply oppose that sort of any of that sort of move. And we also see this extraordinary mixture of policies towards China. The United States continues to take tough line against China in every conceivable respect, yet it still talks about wanting to achieve some kind of dialogue with China. So then we had Secretary Blinken going to Beijing, having a series of very tough meetings with the Chinese, but he did come out with a working party, preparing for a summit meeting with Biden. But the president couldn't contain himself. He made rude statements about President Xi Jinping. He had to circulate them and insist that the entire administration adopt them. And an enormous amount of damage was done. And then somebody came up with the idea of trying to send Yellen to Beijing to repair the damage, except Yellen went to Beijing and came with no real proposal, no actual ideas about how the situation, even in economic terms, could be righted. Instead, she attempted to do that which the Chinese have repeatedly said they find both extremely irritating and unacceptable, which is that she tried to lecture the Chinese on how China should conduct its economic policies, something which the Chinese didn't take to favourably at all. And now we're going to have another strong statement about China. It's apparently already largely drafted, and there is still no real agreement about how to move forward over Ukraine. Ukraine is stuck in limbo. It's not able to join NATO. It's committed to an offensive that was supposed to create political space for NATO at this summit. It has to continue with that offensive. It can't pull back from that offensive, even as that rationale for that offensive has gone. But it's trapped into a constant game of persisting with an offensive that is going nowhere. And I can't help but feel that a lot of this shows, again, a complete failure to think things through, a lack of basic understanding of policy, which is now so much of a hallmark in the United States and in Britain in particular. And I just wanted to reference a speech that has been made by Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, who's appeared on several programs with us on the Duran, and he gave a speech on the 5th of July to shape saving humanity and planet Earth, and he spoke very eloquently about the state of Western policy. And I'm not going to read the whole speech, but there were some paragraphs that stood out for me. He says, "There's something profoundly disheartening about the politics of our countries right now. The deep madness, I'm afraid, is British imperial thinking that has been taken over by the United States. My country, the United States, is unrecognizable now compared even to 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure, to tell you the truth, who runs the country. I do not believe it is the President of the United States right now. We are run by generals, by our security establishment. The public is privy to nothing. The lies that are told about foreign policy are daily and pervasive by a mainstream media that I can barely listen to or read anymore." I would, by the way, echo that. I have to do that every day. I have to listen and read what the mainstream media in Britain and the United States are saying. And it is a constant diet of indigestible material, which I find myself obliged to digest. But anyway, there we go. To go back to what Professor Sachs says, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the main television outlets are 100% repeating government propaganda by the day, and it's almost impossible to break through. What is this about? Well, as you've heard, it's about a madness of the United States to keep US hegemony, a militarized foreign policy dominated by the thinking of generals who are mediocre intellects, personally greedy, and without any sense, because their only modus operandi is to make war. And they are cheerled by Britain, which is unfortunately, in my adult life, increasingly pathetic in being a cheerleader for the United States, for US hegemony, and for war. Whatever the United States says, Britain will say it 10 times more enthusiastically. The UK leadership could not love the war in Ukraine more. It's the great second Crimean War for the British media and for the British political leadership. And I agree with all of that. We have a sense of mediocrity at the top level of our leaders that I have never experienced before in my lifetime. And this summit in Vilnius is the epitome of this. They all come together. They all agree with each other. They have no ideas. They have no plan. They're going to come up with cliches and all sorts of formulaic ideas which will commit themselves to doing that which they are doing already. They're trapped inside a cycle of escalation insisted on by the hardliners in their midst. Only some of them, by the way, are generals, but there are certainly generals amongst them, especially, by the way, in Britain, to my understanding. And the result is that there is no clear way out. Some people on the fringe, as I said, the Washington realists, they want to find a way out, but the political leadership seems incapable of doing it. They put all their stakes on the Ukrainian offensive. I remember reading short time ago, I think it was in Politico, at the time when the offensive started at the beginning of June, that Biden himself was nervous about the outcome of the offensive. He was conscious how much of his reputation and his international weight hanged on it. The offensive has not turned out as he hoped for, as the people around him hoped for. But he has no way back. He has no plan for finding a way out, either for himself or for the rest, for the United States, or for the rest of the world. I cannot conceive of a worse outcome than the one we have at the moment, a continued drift, always with the danger that things will escalate, and with the very high probability of a total debacle in the event that that process of escalation does not reach its ultimate point in a NATO-Russia war, or heaven help us, in a NATO-China war, which would add even greater folly upon the folly we already have. Anyway, it's a fine speech by Professor Sachs, and I just thought I would reference it because it so well describes the abysmal state of our leadership now. So on these troubling thoughts, I'm going to end this program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also find, you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can go to our shop, buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon, and have a very good day.